Well, hello and welcome to day 14, 365 days to racial change. My name is Tomlins Nightbag. Pleasure to see you again. Just so we can get our little housekeeping items out of the way, we're informed on the subject of race and black and white in America by a man named Dr. Claude Anderson. Please get his book, A Black History Reader, 101 Questions You Never Thought to Ask. We are going to reference that work considerably. Black Labor and White Wealth, also another work and more focused, and also his national plan to empower Black America, Powernomics. All very great books, and we'll be getting into those works also. We'll have some fun time, maybe some story time with Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and look at some fictional angles on Black life in America, but I believe they are very real and what in the essence of what they're trying to communicate. Also, finally, hashtag us too, hashtag USTOO. You can plug in to a community. There's many communities, Black communities with Black concerns, with Black voices, with being very intentional, and very real, sober, and honest about our struggle, our victories. But many, I'm finding out as I broach the community that many Blacks are rising up and doing well and holding it together. That being said, I wanted to jump right in to this day 14. Yesterday we did our introduction to God, and the angle is what religion. I don't want to use that word necessarily, but spirituality and the understanding of God was like for the slave, and how even that aspect of life was micromanaged. The slave didn't have, it wasn't a place to go and be free. The master didn't want any freedom. He didn't want that individual, man or woman, to have any sense of ownership, property, family. Tear it all down and tear it all away until the focus is the master's wants and needs and ministering to them and being happy with that. Now, so having said that, we talked yesterday briefly, just hit some bullet points. We can go on forever. But you'll hear me mention consistently, though, how the European thought towards wealth and resources is that if it's unused, then I have a right to take it. Even if people are on it, rely on maybe byproduct of that, we're taking it. Think that there was a time in this country where buffaloes, a lot of animals actually ran in just herds and flocks, and would have been nice for people to share all those resources and to use them adequately. But the white dominant population, like take buffaloes for instance, they were mainly good for the hide and then maybe the head and any horns that the male might have. That those all was good for. You're talking about upwards of a 2,000-pound beast. But these white guys, they knew that hide was valuable, and they would just slaughter whole herds, tear the hides off. Hopefully the animal's dead in this process, and just leave rotting carcasses all over the plains. Conversely, the Native Americans, the so-called Native Americans who were at the time, when they take down the animal, they're going to use every bit of that animal. Um, being mindful of the resource. Having said that, let's talk about that aspect. This is we're going to talk about God in a certain aspect. Call this part 2 or intro, whatever. We're going to look at one verse. This is Matthew 25:26. But his master answered him, "You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and I gather where I have scattered no seed." That's the God that is presented to the slave mind. Now, another aspect of white power and white life is to have, this domination, almost like the Japanese. The Japanese have the idea that their emperor or supreme leader can trace his lineage all the way back to God and creation, and Christians do too, through Adam and Eve, and that whole narrative. Um, but for white European thought is they are especially favored of God. Um, from my early readings here in Dr. Claude Anderson and stuff, I don't get a sense of them having an idea of having a direct lineage, being connected, tracing their lineage all the way back to God. But if they are coming out of the Bible at the time, then um, I'm sure the Adam and Eve story is part of the narrative. And having said that, white is favored in their minds. White is favored in heaven. White is here on earth, is in control and gathering up wealth and resources, freezing them in the white community, and even that translates into the next life where they are still in an elevated status. And they tell slaves that in the next life you'll be elevated and be eye to eye with us, white folks. So this reaping and sowing and taking advantage of wealth and resources that appear stagnant and unused is their mindset. It's their it's their thinking. And there's little to no remorse among the white community about the oppression of blacks, about making a ceiling for them and keeping them locked in to in a vulnerable position of privation and deprivation and struggle, toil. And not only that, but that any proceeds from that activity goes up into white economic structure, and little comes back. It doesn't flow. It goes up into the system there. It doesn't go up and down. We'll talk about vertical integration and ethno-aggregation more in depth as time goes on. So this God that's presented and that we're talking of, reaps where it's not sown, and gathered seeds and cultivates and expects returns on places where work has not necessarily been done. Now the story, we know the story. This king or master goes away, gives 3 servants a portion of wealth to go and trade with. When he comes back, he's going to expect a return, not just equal, 1-to-1 ratio. It's going to be 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 5-to-1 return on this investment. Because of my history, I can only liken it mainly to like drug dealers, their tiers and stuff like that. But I guess a block captain, he's going to distribute a portion of his drugs there on the street, and he's going to come back to those corners and not expect to get back what he left. He's going to get back, double, triple, 5 times what he expected um, from that activity. So God's looking for that same thing. Now in the slave's life, it's sad because the master in the story, when he hears the good news of the first 2 servants, he's happy, and he gives them back a portion in the form of cities. Actually, is how Jesus uh, puts the narrative. Have the one who got, I think, got 5 cities. The one that 2 and did well got 2 cities. But the one guy was afraid. He was fearful. He didn't exercise his choice, and the master's very disturbed with that, and um, cast him out or something, and gives his portion to the guy who had the most, did the best, had some sense of favor. All right, so this is, as we think about black life, white power, slavery, in America, there's a sense of having to understand this arrogance, this entitlement, white entitlement, has its some sources and roots. Now, I don't want that to be a point of discouragement or anger. I think it can be a model as blacks organize, as minds are awakened, as we take a look, where can we exercise that kind of faith? Where can we put ourselves in a position, we're not overtly locked out and um, denied access to resources as much um, as in the slave day, because the white power can't uh, be explicit in keeping us from resources, although we can still see in society, it's very much implied on whites, Asians, Hispanics as a group. Not necessarily all the individuals. I talked a little bit about that. But there's some communities that we will not penetrate and may not want to. Social integration and civil rights did not go far enough, and it didn't put the necessary condition in the hearts of the people in power, and we lost our communities in the process. I'm not talking about just Tulsa, Inglewood, Rosewood, like that kind of violent overthrow of of certain communities. I'm talking about, our common everyday community was obliterated. We had other businesses and a lot of things, sports teams. I just looked at a video. A great gentleman was talking to Dr. Boyce Watkins about the media and how blacks figured prominently in that industry in the early days. We give that up when we perceive, as blacks, we're perceiving that the white direction is just the right way to go. White is right, and one one thing we got to understand is that it's not necessarily the truth. Yeah, we're going to interact, do economics with them. Money's there. That's where a lot of wealth is at. But we need to be wise and understand. You know, one, we need to get back. There needs to be some reciprocation economically of that power and wealth, and we need to understand that somehow we, uh, in our spot, like I'm here, I have time to make videos and chill out. These are my knock around clothes I just wear around my apartment. you know, um, there's some blacks don't have that. Those in prison, there needs to be some outreach. Um, Education for the young needs to be considered, and all that. Um, so in our quest to move forward, we got to think about being deliberate in where we put our energies, having some courage. That servant, that last guy was afraid. He knew the severity of his master, and I don't know. If my master gave me clear instructions and the resources, I think I'm going to go make a move. But he was afraid. Now, here's where there's something I wanted to connect in this story is that he had a choice. He made the wrong choice in the story, but he had a choice. The our um, our narrative is lack of choice, and even in a desire to maximize wealth and resources. Our narrative, black narrative, is navigating some extra hurdles to get ahead. There's a great video about wealth. I'm uh, taking some free courses. I'm checking out some business classes, and one of the videos is about how the whites have a head start. And the guy facilitating the activity, he says, if you have things like if you had a cell phone that you're able to maintain, that was never turned off, or if you went to college and never had to pay for it and there are no outstanding bills, and go take a step or two forward. And of course, you can imagine the majority white. There, I shouldn't say majority white, but the white folks who are there progress. He's going to have a race, and the prize for the race is $100. And but in the back, some of the black people never even took a step. you know, the illustration's obvious. So there was no choice. Um, this conversation is going to finally get to something called Willie Lynchism and black codes and a lot of deliberate designs. It's very sadistic, is the only word I can think of, to keep that black slave absolutely dependent and to think of the master as the next thing to God. You know. So that's part of another angle when we talk about God, and it's about how God is communicated to slaves, and does that mentality still penetrate even to this day? Over 400 years, has any narrative, teaching, preaching about God to the slaves prevail to this day? We've got a lot of I think, access to freedoms, and we're not as restricted. But you don't. Church for the slave began as a place that was still just a part of Master's house, of Master's plan, Master's intention. You know, that even in there, I mean, the slave master is in the bedroom, he's in the family, in work, economics, in church. Um, the white masters made sure the control was absolute and complete, and that no area was left unturned. Um, on top of that, you can imagine they reinforced any idea, any uh, group that looked powerful in the Bible, they ascribed to themselves, and the passages about slavery, way back in Exodus, and those stories. And Paul talks about it in some of his places about obedience and things like that, how the slave should be in the world. So um, this sowing and reaping, this magically creating resources, wealth, and power out of nothing was the magic, was the mystique, in a sense, of the slave master. The slave was that one instrument to go out, gather those resources, that that unpaid labor for the master, give those goods, that cotton, that tobacco, to the master, and the master would then maximize on those gathered resources. So that's today's uh, part two about God. We'll probably talk about God often, especially um, now I've mentioned how God's presented in the few moments I've encountered the subject in Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uh, Occasionally we'll get to it. I don't want, this is not going to be a Bible study. This is just a reflection on how's the slave encounter God? How does white power manipulate that narrative? And what, if any, continuing, ongoing issues are there with that in the 21st century? Here now we're about 1/5 into the 21st century at 2019, moving forward. You know, how do we undo any psychological, spiritual damage, issues of approaching God? I tried to communicate. I don't think I did a good job yesterday about how truth is going to come through. I believe there's truth there, what we call the Word of God or the Bible. You know, there's truth in what you hold as your spiritual center, Buddha, Allah, whatever. I think whatever benevolent approach, what good approach towards spirituality is something I'm down with, I can accept, I can go with. Uh, so for the slave, that even in the midst of manipulation, of focus, ascribing uh, different traits to different characters, and then, you know, sitting, trying to, you're trying to have, you know, this Sunday, um, this supposed day of rest. So this religion wasn't introduced right away, I don't believe. You know, it came about, I'm sure there was a lot of discussion, okay, how do we tell these people about this power, yet have them maintain their position under. All right, it's the same way the framers of the Constitution. I got a piece coming up about that. They had to say, well, how do we talk about land of the free, home of the brave, opportunities, and all this for everyone, but exclude blacks? I get it. 3/5 of a human being. That's how. So we define them, they're not human. That's a pretty drastic step. But you think, man, that's before the light bulb was even invented, before electricity was discovered. You know, they they dehumanized. Their answer was to dehumanize. So this they did the same thing as manipulating God's word, but the truth, so the essence of what God, this power, wants to communicate to everyone, still makes its way through. And minds properly adjusted, not even minds, more if it's a spiritual conversation of the soul, is going to resonate with what it needs to resonate with to understand and properly receive and work with this spiritual information. That's day 14. I'm Tomlin's Nyback. Thanks again. I have no idea what I'm talking about tomorrow. I think education's coming up, and these are just brief bullet points. We're just kind of flying over peaks of mountains. Thanks for hanging out. See you again on this 365-day challenge.